Hello everyone, welcome to Ambient Insights. I'm Dilusha Gamage. Sri Lanka has, in the recent past, navigated one of the most challenging and demanding economic time periods. Yet again, we are facing a turbulent time. And these challenges has constrained the country's ability to attract foreign direct investments significantly. However, through the stabilization influence of the IMF program and the disciplined implementation of the structural reforms, Sri Lanka has demonstrated a robust recovery. And this has positioned the country as an increasingly compelling investment destination within the region. Some forward thinking professionals have recognized this emerging opportunity and took advantage and captured the potential of Sri Lanka's recovery. And today we are turning our attention to one such initiative, that is the Sri Lanka Opportunity Fund, launched in February 2026. And to provide us with the deeper understanding about the fund, its vision, the strategy, the objectives, and about the fund's future, we are joined with Mr. Asant Sebastian, the Chief Investment Officer of ACP Asset Management. Asant, welcome to Ambient Insights.
Thanks for having me.
Asant, so to start off about the interview, before moving on to the fund, let's talk a little bit about you. And can you please take us through about your career so far and how you have joined with ACP Asset Management?
Sure. So basically, I grew up I was born in Zambia and then moved to Australia when I was 2 years old. And then I studied finance in Australia, and then I worked at over 20 years in finance at a couple of large investment banks across trading, structuring, and asset management roles, and then also at the Australian Stock Exchange, where I ran the funds and listed products division for the ASX. And then in 2010, I was joined by my business partner, Sharad Sridharan, where we decided to both leave our jobs and set up ACP Asset Management as a boutique investment house to look at opportunities across Asia. And Sri Lanka was one of the markets we focused on because the war had just finished in Sri Lanka in 2009, and we thought there was opportunity in Sri Lanka, and since then we've been investing in Sri Lanka. Today, ACP Asset Management is licensed across 4 jurisdictions. So we're licensed in Australia, where we have a asset management license, in Singapore, where we have structures and funds, in the US, where we recently set up a entity called Corland Wealth Management, and in Sri Lanka we also have a license for investment management or unit trust management in Sri Lanka. So I guess from the context of the Sri Lanka Opportunity Fund, our Australian licensed vehicle, which is ACP Quorum, which is a joint venture between us and a Swiss asset manager called Quorum Asset Management, is the regulated entity that provides the investment management for the Sri Lanka Opportunity Fund.
Okay, that sounds like, so that is about 26 years after leaving the jobs and starting the ACP Asset Management for you. All right, so can you tell us about the Sri Lanka Opportunity Fund? When you started that, what is the vision behind the fund?
Sure. So it's been a long journey to get this fund up and running given European regulations. So back in 2021, we set up another product called Sri Lanka Investment Limited, which is a actively managed certificate, which is also a European type of product, but not as regulated as a UCITS fund. So we set that up in 2021, and we've been investing through that fund since 2021. And as a part of that, a lot of the investors who came into that product wanted us to set up a UCITS fund. And that was the vision for setting this up. And our partners in Quorum and another German group called GSR, they had set up similar country-specific funds for Vietnam and had raised, over $250 million back in 2010, 2011 for Vietnam. And they felt that now is the time for Sri Lanka to also look at similar investment products like Vietnam had back in the day.
So you use the word UCITS, UCITS. What does that mean, Asant?
So UCITS stands for Undertakings for Collective Investment in Transferable Securities. So it's similar to a mutual fund or what we would have here as a unit trust.
Okay.
Except it's the EU regulation for that type of vehicle, and it can have both institutional investors or retail investors depending on the tranche of the fund. But it is highly regulated and there's a lot of compliance around the product. So, for example, you can't have more than 10% in one security. There has to be daily liquidity for investors to redeem units or buy units in the fund. And then it has other rules like, for example, the top 5 positions in the fund can't be more than 40% of the total net asset value of the fund. So it is highly regulated and there's a lot of compliance around it, and that has to be managed correctly. And that is the reason for this. The other benefit of a UCITS fund is it can be passported across the whole EU. So that means we can attract funds from any EU country into this fund, and it is also well recognized across Asia and the Middle East as well as a fund for investment.
Okay, so it's a EU regulated fund, the Opportunity Fund. All right, and also Asant, now what prompted ACP Asset Management and ACP Quorum to introduce this regulated, highly regulated UCITS fund specifically for Sri Lanka?
So basically, ACP Quorum and our partners in Quorum, as I mentioned, had invested in markets like Vietnam. They've invested in other frontier markets in Africa. Although it's a small part of their portfolio, they feel that frontier markets can add alpha to an investor's portfolio in Europe, and gives diversification outside of other global or larger markets. So the idea for setting this up at the time through ACP Quorum was basically we wanted to have a highly regulated vehicle to provide investors with exposure to Sri Lanka. So if you look at it currently, for 1% of your portfolio as a institutional asset manager in Europe, you won't go through the hassle of setting up a local custody account, local CDS account to invest into Sri Lanka.
None of that is required.
So none of that is required because they just invest directly into the fund custody in Europe, and then through the sub-custodian, which is Deutsche Bank Colombo, they get exposure to the equities or bonds in Sri Lanka. So I think the challenge that Sri Lanka has had in attracting foreign investment is because it is not an investment destination that a lot of people know about or think about daily. For 1% of your allocation, for example, the regulatory and compliance of going through setting up a custody account plus a CDS account is something they won't want to do. And that's the reason that prompted us to set up this fund.
So you take that pain away from them and gives them a easier vehicle to enter Sri Lanka.
Correct.
Okay. And Asant, if I may ask you, if you outline the core investment sectors of the Opportunity Fund, is it equity, fixed income, or how does it allocate?
So this is the process we went through. Given it took us a long time to get the approval from the EU regulator because of the, I guess, liquidity or illiquidity, you could say, of Sri Lanka compared to other markets. So 30% of the fund has to be in fixed income instruments at all times. So these can be dollar denominated bonds that Sri Lanka has issued, rupee bonds or bills that Sri Lanka has issued, or dollar denominated, say, treasuries or products that to maintain that liquidity. So that's one aspect of the investment. The second is we can invest in the balance 70% can be invested in equities, as long as it meets the UCITS criteria I mentioned before about that 10% rule, etc. But that can be Sri Lankan equities listed on the CSE, but also companies with exposure to Sri Lanka. So for example, I know you interviewed Capital Metals, so it could be Capital Metals listed on London we could invest in, We could invest in, say, an Adani Ports, which has port infrastructure in Sri Lanka. So these are also investments that we can make in the fund itself.
But does it have to be listed in some exchange?
Yes.
It has to be listed.
It has to be listed because
And has an exposure to Sri Lanka.
Has an exposure to Sri Lanka, correct.
Okay. And so the fund has already secured initial seed capital of $10 million. Is that correct?
Yeah, at the moment we're at about 20 million. So we had 20 million when we launched the fund, and now it's increased because other investors have come in as well.
Okay. And another 25, or now it must be about another 5 million or 15 million
So
expected?
we're at about 20 at the moment,
Right.
but we hope to get to about 30 to 35 quite soon because we have some existing investors who are looking at allocating further into the fund itself.
Okay. And from which geographies that you are getting this funding? Now you said this is open for EU. So is it the all EU countries, or where are you getting the funding?
So at the moment, since it's been a lot of our existing investors and partners through Quorum and GSR and net funds, it's been mainly German-speaking Europe. So we have Germany, Switzerland, Austria, for example. There are a couple of other investors. For example, we have Belgium, a family office from Belgium, and a family office from Finland as well. But the idea would be to tap the other EU countries as well. And at the moment, we only have an institutional tranche in the fund.
I see.
So we don't have a retail tranche, it's only for institutional investors. So these guys are mainly fund of funds, independent asset managers or wealth managers, and family offices who are investing in the fund.
But is it open for retail investors as well?
We are looking at a retail tranche as well, but that might take another 6 months down the road to get that retail tranche going.
Okay. And now you're planning to build this fund towards $100 million. And how are you planning to build that? Is it through the same geographies that you mentioned, or what's your expansion plan?
So we will be primarily focusing on the European market, but also, for example, London and the UK is a market where there are a lot of frontier asset managers that we'll be speaking to, and we hope to do a road show in London in about mid-May. Along with that, I think Asia is also a market that we will focus on, predominantly being Singapore, Hong Kong, these areas with family offices, private banks, etc. And the Middle East is also a market that we look to target as well going forward.
Okay. And now when we look at $100 million in Sri Lankan context, it can be a significant amount. So in Sri Lankan context, we can say this is a milestone investment for Sri Lanka. How would you look at it?
I think what we have seen is it has put Sri Lanka on the investment map or landscape, particularly for a lot of European investors who weren't looking at Sri Lanka. And we have got a lot of inquiries from, for example, from family offices, etc. And a lot of these people might have come and visited Sri Lanka, and they like the country and like what it's about, but they've never had a vehicle to really get exposure to the market. So I think that is one of the most interesting things. And we have also had feedback from other, say, multi-country UCITS fund managers who are in frontier markets that this is a positive for the country and potentially helps them also to look at allocation or more allocation into Sri Lanka. So I think that collaboration will also help potentially the market with more international investors coming in, more liquidity and price discovery for the exchange as well.
So it will attract more foreign funds to Sri Lanka.
Hopefully. I think a lot of them are potentially waiting for things like a ratings upgrade. But I think over time we will gradually see more interest, and I think awareness is also growing with this product.
Yeah. And now, if I may ask you now, how you envision Sri Lankan investment landscape? if you look at the next 3 to 5 years, how would you look at it? What's your expectation?
I think, like you stated when you started the interview, where in your summary, Sri Lanka has gone through this phase of, we had the economic crisis, then it's gone through this reform and, macro development, and, there's been a lot of positives that have come out of the reforms, etc. So I think over the next 3 to 5 years, it's really capitalizing on what's been built and looking at the growth and the growth trajectory that Sri Lanka can sustain over the next, say, 3 to 5 years. So I think from an investment landscape perspective, hopefully we see more listings on the exchange to improve the number of securities that can be invested into, and also potentially we'll see new products on the exchange. But I think from an investment landscape, from an exchange perspective, and the companies that are there, it's still relatively well priced and attractive when you look at regional peers as well as other frontier markets. So I think if Sri Lanka can maintain, political stability and maintain the reform momentum, and hopefully there's not too much geopolitical and global instability, I think it sets us up for a compelling 3 to 5 years as an investment landscape. And what we always tell our investors is, I guess Sri Lanka is India light to some extent. So they're always surprised when they go to India and then they come to Sri Lanka and they're like, it's so much less chaotic and easier to navigate, and they love the country. So I think they like India as an investment destination, and there are a number of UCITS funds that already invest and allocate to India. But the challenge with India for a lot of these guys is some feel they've missed the boat and now it's too expensive. And that potentially is a reason to look at Sri Lanka. So I think that's what we see from an investment landscape perspective. If we can also tie on to India's growth story, more so, the growth of Sri Lanka will also hopefully accelerate.
Having India as the big brother for Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And also, Asant, how do you see the fund influencing the liquidity and the foreign participation? Because we have seen that the foreign participation in the Colombo Stock Exchange is very weak in the recent past. So how can the fund bring some interest in that side?
Yeah, I think, for example, we just started allocating some of the funds to some shares on the exchange. So I think with that, as more inflow comes into the fund and we invest more into the fund, hopefully we can, shift that some of that net outflow, and there'll be some net inflow. Yeah, we're still running our other AMC strategy as well, so that continues to invest daily on the exchange as well. But I think also it might help, for example, if companies do rights issues or things like that, where the fund can also participate. Hopefully that also helps some of the listed companies in their growth as well. And hopefully long term, with more international participation and more funds coming in, we'll see smaller bid-ask spreads on the exchange and maybe less illiquidity and more volume also.
Okay, wonderful. And how does the Sri Lanka Opportunity Fund differentiates, now let's say, from other frontier market vehicles? Like now Vietnam is a very compelling investment case, and Bangladesh or even Africa. How does the Opportunity Fund differentiate itself?
So if you look at the frontier market fund universe, there are a lot of multi-country frontier funds. So they will do, say, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Africa, and all the frontier markets would be in one frontier or emerging market fund, where they would have allocation to frontier as well. A lot of countries don't have country-specific funds. Vietnam being one of those. Obviously, larger markets like India, etc., have country-specific funds. India has country-specific funds. So the Sri Lanka Opportunity Fund is the first time there's been a country-specific fund for Sri Lanka. That is following the EU regulation under this UCITS framework. So it's only focused on Sri Lanka, and that's a big differentiating factor. And hopefully, as Sri Lanka also develops as an investment destination, the fund will be the go-to for investors to get exposure to Sri Lanka.
The one and only UCITS fund for Sri Lanka.
Correct.
All right. And now, Asant, what is the strength that ACP brings? Now, ACP, this is not the first time that you're investing in Sri Lanka through a fund. Experience, research, or how does ACP's influence to the fund?
Sure. I think so. Few things. One is the compliance and regulation. We already understand the international compliance and regulation that a lot of one that the fund needs, and two that institutional investors need, whether that be from a due diligence perspective, asset allocation perspective, and what they're looking for and how to manage that on a daily basis. Given our past experience and doing this for many years, I think that's one thing we bring to the table. Also, I think we've been living and breathing Sri Lanka for 15 years now and have been through the ups and downs of various cycles. So we understand, I think, how to manage or navigate some of these challenges that we see in frontier markets like Sri Lanka. And also from an investment perspective, we generally do our own research in-house, and we try to allocate to securities where we think, there'll be one long-term capital appreciation, but also we try to get in early in securities maybe where other investors are not in there in the beginning. So that are some of the, I guess, things we try to focus on. And our experience also is we've been very good at working with international investors and partners. And these are some of the things that, from a capital raising perspective, also some of the advantages I think ACP has is that we have, a global network licensing that can help to attract these investors, and we understand what they're looking for and how they want to allocate funds. So these are some of our, I think, plus points that we have.
So ACP understand the investor's perspective and also the destination of the investments in Sri Lanka, how the landscape works.
Yes, correct.
And what would you identify as the biggest challenge when you're investing in Sri Lanka? Let's say about short term and then long term. What are the biggest challenges you see?
In the capital market space,
Yes,
you're talking about?
For opportunity funds investments, basically capital markets.
I think short term, obviously, some of the challenges are looking at trying to get some sizable positions at the right price, given that the liquidity in some stocks is not that high. That's some of the challenges I think in the short term as we enter positions, and then in the longer term also potentially exiting some positions. Also, there can be some challenges at times depending on the macro environment that Sri Lanka is going through during that phase. So I think timing is one thing which is a challenge when investing, and also having the right allocations and having that diversification. I think to manage liquidity in a structure like this is also going to be a challenge over the short to medium term. But hopefully we can manage that out.
How are you going to manage that, Asant?
I think we'll look to allocate majority of the funds to more liquid shares, and also we have that 30% buffer in US
Fixed income.
US dollar denominated fixed income and bills and bonds locally. So that should manage, and also I think a lot of the institutional investors we have are medium to long term, so they're not going to invest today and pull out their funds tomorrow. We saw even with the actively managed certificate, they have invested in 21, and then even through the crisis, they didn't pull out. They in fact invested more money and doubled down on Sri Lanka. So I think with investors like that, it's easier to manage that out, given that they will be there for the medium to long term, and we won't see daily redemptions on the fund for these institutional guys.
So it's like more astute investors who understands the cycles of the markets.
Correct. Yeah, I was actually speaking to one investor yesterday, and he was saying, because we've been staying out of the market given the recent, global uncertainty with what's going on in the Middle East, etc. His view was you should at least be 50 to 60% allocated to the market through the opportunity fund, and he said, look, if we go down, we all go down together, and if we go up, we go up together. So they are open to taking that risk as well, and they understand it's a frontier market.
All right, that's wonderful. And Asant, now, if I may ask you, how about the diaspora? Do you have any option to attract the diaspora also to this fund, or how does it really works?
So from a diaspora perspective, at the moment we have an institutional tranche.
Okay.
But if they, for example, anyone who can invest more than $10,000 is technically classified as an institutional investor according to EU regulations. So from a diaspora perspective, we can look at discussing with diaspora and seeing how they can allocate to the fund. If they are in Europe, it'll probably make it easier for them to allocate, or they'd have to have, say, private banking relationships in other markets, whether it be Australia or Singapore or the Middle East. Then they can, because the fund has an ISIN, so they can easily book it to their investment account in those markets itself. So the plans for the diaspora is one, that retail tranche later that we were looking at, and also working more closely with, say, the banks, local banks potentially, or even government, to look at how we can potentially work with them to directly attract the diaspora, I think, is something we're still trying to figure out at the moment.
That comes in the future.
Yes.
And Asad, last but not least, as a professional who's actively managing funds in Sri Lanka, what would be your advice or your message for the global investors who are evaluating Sri Lanka as an investment case, frontier market opportunity? So what would be your message to them?
So I think what we always tell new investors is, look, no one wakes up, or no institutional investor wakes up in the morning and says, hey, I want an allocation to Sri Lanka in my portfolio. So I think what we always tell them is, Sri Lanka is in a region of giants in terms of population. No, you have India with 1 billion, you have Pakistan with 200 odd million, Bangladesh is there with 160 million people, etc. And the only one they all get along with in South Asia is Sri Lanka. So it's the way we like to explain it to investors is, Sri Lanka has the potential, and they say it themselves. They say, oh, look, you're almost like a Switzerland in South Asia to these guys, where Switzerland does the same thing in Europe in terms of attracting capital, etc. Obviously, we're not there yet in terms of where Switzerland is. But I think from what we always tell foreign investors is, look, from Sri Lanka has opportunity from a logistics perspective, services perspective, banking and financial perspective, and if we can, an export-oriented perspective, even if you look at minerals and etc., to really capitalize and develop on these things. And with the region we're in and the number of people in this region, we can definitely, one, attract more investment and FDI from the region for infrastructure and development, which will sustain Sri Lanka for the long term. And if we can just work closely with, say, our neighbors, as well as India and China, and tag on to their growth story, Sri Lanka definitely has a long way and a lot of potential. So this is something we tell them. And at the same time, our valuations from a capital markets perspective are, say, half of India's, and one of the cheapest markets in Asia. So we all, and with good governance across our, for example, the regulators are very good, whether it be the central bank or the CSE. And I think the governance of our companies is significantly better than a lot of other frontier markets. So I think when we explain this to investors, they see the attraction and appeal, and they definitely like the valuation story, particularly the value investors who are looking at long-term growth and capital appreciation.
That's wonderful. And Asant, I think we have to wish you all the very best for you and the Sri Lanka Opportunity Fund. And I believe personally, maybe that can be a vehicle that brings or attracts the foreign direct investments to Sri Lanka and also the Colombo Stock Exchange, which is much needed at this moment. And as a compelling investment case, the way you are promoting Sri Lanka is something which is really needed at the moment. And thank you very much, Asant, for joining with Ambion Insights. Despite your busy schedule and in the market hours, thank you very much for joining with us. And we wish you all the very best.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for watching Ambion Insights, and we will be back soon with another exciting episode.